Once again, welcome everyone to New South Wales DPI Dairy Webinar 21, Challenges and Opportunities with Nutritional Management of Cow's Milk with AMS. My name is Nicholas Lyons. I'm the leader dairy with New South Wales DPI, but today's webinar is not about me. I'll just be chairing this webinar here today. Our guest speaker today is Trevor DeVries. Trevor holds a Bachelor in Agriculture and a PhD in Animal Science from the University of British Columbia in Canada. He did his postdoctoral position within the Agricultural and Agri-Food Canada at the Lethbridge Research Centre. He's currently a professor and a Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behaviour and Welfare. And Trevor is interested in dairy production, nutritional management, animal welfare and behavior, amongst other things, I guess. And yeah, I want to thank Trevor for his kindness in sharing a bit of his insight and knowledge today with us here. Trevor and I have met and communicated over the last couple of years in areas related to dairy production and robotic milking. So it's great to have Trevor today here with us. And yeah, I'll share presentation rights with you, Trevor, now, and you should be ready to take it on as from here.
Great. So thank you very much. And can you see me okay?
We can see you absolutely fine.
Can see me and hear me? That's great. Excellent. Well, thanks, Nico, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and to give this webinar. I say this evening for me, and tomorrow morning for those of you that are listening further to the east of me. As just introduced, the topic of the webinar today is challenges and opportunities with nutritional management of cows and automated milking systems. And what I'd like to present is kind of a collection of research that we've done specifically in this area, and highlight some of the, as the title would suggest, challenges, but also opportunities that may exist there. I guess one of the reasons why I'm interested in robotic milking specifically is the fact that we've seen a dramatic increase in the adoption of robotic milking within our Canadian dairy industry and worldwide, for that matter. This is just a map from last year, so about a year old, showing the distribution of farms across Canada using robotic milking who are on official milk test. And so this wouldn't be all the farms, and at about a year ago, it was about 11% of those farms that were on milk recording. Some of the estimates would probably put us closer to over 15 to 20% of farms in total that are currently using robotic milking, and at least about that many or that percentage of the cow population within Canada. And as you can see on the map, these are numbers of farms and percentages by area, that we have a fairly good distribution across all regions of Canada, particularly in the western part, where we see close to 20% or more of the farms using robotic milking systems. Just for interest's sake, one of the things that we've been working on in the last couple of years is a large benchmarking study. And so we have data from almost 200 farms from across Canada, looking at herd housing and management, and relating that to production. And I just thought I would highlight some mean kind of variables from that, just to give you a sense of what our Canadian dairy industry looks like from a robotic milking standpoint. And again, this is a snapshot. This is about a quarter of kind of the available herds that were on milk recording at the time where you recruited for this study. But it should give you an idea of what our industry typically kind of looks like. And so mean number of lactating cows about 110, on the low end just below 40, up to almost 1,000 cows. And again, there are some herds that are even bigger than that within the country. Mean number of cows per robotic unit or AMS unit is just under 50. Again, quite a bit of variability around there. The typical farm would have anywhere from 2 to 3 robotic units. And looking at the bottom left there, you can see that the average farm would typically have one or two lactating groups or groups with robots. In terms of production, as you see on the right-hand side there, milk yield for Holstein herds, which are about over 90% of the industry and represented there, would be close to 38 kilos with kind of typical milk fat of 4% and 3.4% protein. And our non-Holstein herds are obviously lower production as we'd expect and higher components. From a housing perspective, again, a whole bunch of different things I could share with you, but these are just some highlights of that. All these herds, I'll point out, are what we describe as confinement or intensive type systems. So basically cows inside 365 days a year, maybe some very limited grazing or outside opportunities in some herds, but definitely not the majority for sure. Most of these herds, from a cow traffic standpoint, which I'll talk a little bit about today, are free traffic. So almost 90% of those herds are free traffic. The predominant housing type would be a freestall, so over 90% freestall, with about just under 6% being pack barns and some mixed farms as well, where they would have both freestalls as well as pack areas for their cows. In terms of bedding base, the majority, 60% or close to that, would be a mattress-based stall, whereas close to just over 40% would be deep bedding. And then of the bedding types used, we're looking at the majority of those using organic bedding, so straw or wood shavings, and about 1/4 or just over 1/4 using sand in their stalls. Now, getting back to the adoption of robotic milking in the industry or automated milking in the industry, obviously with kind of rapid adoption in Canada and throughout the world, there's obviously got to be benefits to that. And that's something that we've explored in previous research, specifically with our Canadian dairy producers. And this is a series of studies we published a few years back where we surveyed a large sample of farms in Canada, and we demonstrated that the producers perceived a whole bunch of benefits associated with the adoption of robotic milking, including greater milking frequency and yield, and those are things that we actually verified on farm as well. Improved cow health and reproduction, greater herd management, and part of that is greater data collection and use of that data. Less and more flexible use of labor, which is a big contributing factor to that adoption. And then finally, improved profitability and quality of life. And that last bit there, the quality of life, is really what drives most of our dairy producers towards the adoption of robotic milking. And interestingly, they don't only cite their own quality of life, but a lot of these producers in that work also cited the quality of lives of their cows, so suggesting that there was some benefit there as well. Now, obviously, not everything works out as we would always expect, and so even though there are these benefits, there's going to be challenges, or as I put here, impediments to success in robotic milking farms. And again, there's probably more than what I'm going to describe today, but I would say that probably the biggest challenge when we're thinking about robotic milking is the fact that we're putting the act of milking into the hands or feet of the cow, so to speak. And so things that prevent cows from milking voluntarily are really probably going to be our biggest impediments to success, because that's really the crux of using robotic milking systems, is to have cows be able to milk voluntarily. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about in this presentation, is highlight some of these factors that might be problematic there. And so situations where, say, cows can't milk when they want to, cows that don't want to milk, and then improper nutritional management. And that's really the kind of, I guess, overall focus of my presentation will be that last part. But before we can talk about nutrition, we have to make sure that those other 2 points are covered as well, because a lot of what we do from a nutritional management standpoint hinges on getting those cows to the robotic unit. And so if cows can't get to it or they don't want to, that's going to have a negative impact on our nutritional management strategies in those systems as well. And so first, just to describe situations where cows can't milk when they want to, probably that's going to be mostly influenced by barn design and management, and specifically in indoor type systems, the layout of the facility, the density of that facility are going to have a significant role in terms of getting or allowing cows to milk when they want to. And again, a number of things we could discuss here. Probably one of the biggest question marks that we have in our industry is how we should be laying out barns and designing barns from a cow traffic or flow perspective to kind of optimize that ability of cows to milk voluntarily. And so that's a question we often get, is how does cow traffic influence the ability of cows to milk when they want to? And specifically thinking in our system, where in our indoor systems where we primarily have kind of two philosophies. On the left, you see the free traffic system where cows can freely go to and from the robot without any kind of directional gates or selection gates, whereas we have guided systems as well, either feed first or milk first, where cows have to pass through a selection gate, either on their way to the feed bunk in a milk first type scenario, or on return from the feed bunk in a feed first type scenario, whereby that selection gate will indicate whether or not that cow should be milked or not. And I'll talk about this later. The guided systems would be more similar to what you'd experience, say, in a grazing type system, where they're more similar to kind of a milk first type system, where those cows really, to gain access to the next paddock that you want that cow to get to, the cow would have to move towards the robot and pass through that selection gate, which would determine whether or not that cow's ready for milking or not. In our intensive kind of indoor systems in Canada, we see both systems. We see success in those systems. Obviously, as I mentioned before, within the industry, there's overwhelming adoption of the free traffic, but there's still a lot of questions about what is optimal. And again, not a ton of really good research to say one is better than the other. There's lots of good evidence to suggest that we can manage both systems kind of to good production and good visits, good milking activity. But I just wanted to highlight one recent result, and this comes out of that big study I was just describing. When focusing on 75 herds here in Ontario, Canada, the province where I live, where again about 90% of those that partook in our study were free traffic versus about 10% guided, what we observed was that we actually saw greater milking visits in those free traffic herds as opposed to the guided traffic herds in that study. And when we modeled that out, and this is again that increase in visits is taking into account all kinds of other differences in housing and management. When we model that difference in milking visits out, that's about 2.1 kilos difference in milk production per cow per day. And so that's quite a significant amount that we need to be concerned with. Now, again, that's what we're seeing in the industry. The question comes back to whether or not one system is better than the other, and specifically from a cow perspective. And I always like to make the point that both can work very well with good management. However, if management is not optimal, we have different risks. And my experience has been that in a guided system, and there's some data to suggest this as well, that in the guided systems, the cows are at greater risk of problems, including fewer meals, more slug feeding at the feed bunk, longer waiting times for milking. Those things can put them at acidosis. It can cause excess standing times, so things that are not desirable from that perspective. Whereas in a free traffic system, when the management isn't optimal, it's typically the farmers who are at greater risk in terms of their need for fetching cows and making sure they're getting those cows to the robot. And so the question then becomes, is whose behavior is easier to manage? And again, maybe some debate on that even, but I would like to take care of my cows first. And so my bias would be to making sure we treat the cows right from the start, and so we can manage their behavior better in those free traffic systems, in my opinion, and then take care of the producers after the fact and the management around that. Now, another aspect that we need to consider when we're thinking about voluntary milking in robotic milking systems is situations where cows do not want to go milk. And that's probably, if not even a bigger issue for us. And again, a number of different things that might influence that. including just the cows themselves. And we've got some new research coming, and I won't describe that today, but just looking at individual behavioral differences or personality, so to speak, that might be driving some of these differences in the willingness of cows to milk voluntarily. Probably one of the biggest challenges that we have in the industry related to this is the mobility of the cows, and specifically thinking about lameness. And we know lameness is a concern in the dairy industry, and it has been a concern for a long time. And it is even a greater concern for our robotic milking dairies. And again, it doesn't take much for us to realize that lameness is obviously an impediment or something that's causing a reduced mobility in that cow, often related to pain in a hoof or leg of that animal. And so reduced mobility, often associated with pain, is going to reduce the willingness and desire of that cow then to get up and walk to a robotic milking unit. And so we see those effects of lameness compounded in our robotic milking system farms. And so we've done a bunch of research over the last number of years trying to look at this, not only trying to see what kind of levels of lameness that we see, but also the effects of that and some of the risk factors for that on our herds as well. And one of the concerning things is that the average level of lameness, and this is the percentage of cows at a herd level that we're diagnosing as having a gait abnormality. And so anything kind of on a 3 or greater on a 5-point gait score, which would basically classify cows as mild or moderately lame. And what we see is that the average percentage is about 26%. And that falls right in line with kind of average industry estimates from a lot of other places in the world. And so it suggests that our robotic farms aren't that much better from that perspective. But what you do see is that each of these bars represents a different farm. And so you see some farms performing very well, but again, many farms that aren't doing as well. And so it does represent a challenge for us. And that average level of lameness and that range around that can then obviously have an impact on the performance of those cows within those herds. And so that's, again, something that we've looked at. And this is from that same study where we demonstrated, and it shouldn't surprise us, that lame cows have more involuntary milkings, and so more fetches. In fact, we found they were 2.2 times more likely to be fetched than a sound cow. And what's interesting to point out is that the majority of these lame cows are what we classify as fairly mildly lame, so walking with just a slight gait abnormality, whereby we actually see very little severe lameness in these robotic milking herds. And I think that's because those severely lame cows are even more obvious than they are maybe in a conventional system, barn and parlor type system, whereby those cows will be pushed up to get up and go milk, whereas in a robotic milking system, they're just not going to milk. And so those cows are probably being treated and or culled or euthanized earlier than they would be in a conventional type system. Now, as a result of a decreased mobility, increased need for fetching, we also see that those cows are milking less often. And so in the case of the study, we see about a 0.3 milkings per day difference between those cows that are lame versus sound. And as a result of that, or in combination, we see that those cows are producing less milk. And so about 1.6 kilogram difference actually in milk production between those cows that are sound versus lame. And again, this is significant because if we look across lots of studies that have been done over the years looking at lameness and the effects on production, often we'll find either no difference, because sometimes it is our higher producing cows that may be at risk, not necessarily, but in some cases it is, as well as some estimates that aren't as big as this. And this is one of the larger estimates of a kind of a milk production difference between lame and sound cows, specifically when thinking that most of these lame cows are fairly mildly lame. And again, I think it's because we're compounding that issue of lameness in these robotic herds where they just don't, those cows just don't have the desire to milk as voluntarily. So a question then that comes to mind, or that we need to answer, is what is actually contributing to the lameness on these robotic milking dairies? And that's, again, a question that we've tried to investigate and look at and answer. And really, through a number of studies that we've done, the easy answer is that it's mostly things that affect the standing and lying behavior of the cows. And so really things that either allow that cow to spend as much time lying down, as you see in the picture here, as possible, or as protective, or as a risk factor for lameness, things that are going to force that cow to spend more time standing outside that stall in, say, manure-covered wet alleys that are going to be risk factors for not only infectious, but also non-infectious hoof problems. And so things related to stall size, bedding comfort, stocking density are all going to have a significant impact there. And again, if I summarize kind of the results of a variety of studies that we've done, that's really what we see. And so in say 3 studies to date where we've specifically looked at risk factors for lameness in robotic or automated milking herds, we see less lameness with more or greater stall width, which we know again is going to promote more time lying in the stall, as well as more time standing outside of these alleys within the barn, more lunge space, so making it easier for those cows to get up and down in their stalls, having deep sand bedding as opposed to mattress-based stalls, having lesser stocking density, so fewer cows per stall or per robotic milking unit. And then lastly, interestingly there as well, we have some association with more bunk space as well, so less lameness with more feeding space for cows. And again, that makes sense, and we'll talk about this later, in that a robotic milking scenario, if we have more space, those cows can use their time more efficiently. They're less likely to spend extra time standing around waiting for feed, and as a result of that, we decrease kind of the risk or pressure on the hooves of those animals. What's interesting about these risk factors is that if we then look at, say, studies or situations where cows are kept out of barns, like in a pasture environment, we actually see some very similar type risk factors. And so when we look at studies that have looked at lameness in pasture-based systems, where again, we don't necessarily always think lameness is a problem, but we do know that there are situations where we can and do observe significant amounts of lameness. And again, the risk factors for lameness are really the same. And so things like moisture, again, moisture in the environment, we know that's going to be tough on hooves. It softens hooves, it increases risk of bacterial pathogens that are going to potentially cause infectious foot disorders, weakening of that sole of that cow, space in holding yards, again, overcrowded situations, potentially putting more stress on the feet of the cows as well, more risk of injury there. And then interesting as well, even feed pad space, and that fits with our kind of our freestall dairy data as well, whereby we know that if there's just not enough space there at, say, a feed pad outside of a within a pasture dairy where we've got a feed pad outside either a robot or say a shed with a milking parlor, we're going to see cows crowding there and waiting for feed access. And the longer they have to wait for feed access, the footing conditions, the extra standing time are all going to be risk factors for those cows for, say, developing lameness in those scenarios. So that's kind of a quick overview of things that are going to prevent the cows from kind of, milking voluntarily from a housing standpoint, from a cow perspective. The other factor which I mentioned is improper nutritional management, and that's really what I wanted to spend the rest of the presentation talking about, is how that then may influence the ability of cows to milk voluntarily, and what are some of the bottlenecks that are imposed there. And when we think about nutritional management, that's probably a good point to pause and think about what actually motivates dairy cows to milk in a robotic milking system. And again, we can think, well, it has to do with the layout of the barn and all these things, but all those decisions of the cow to go to the robot or to seek out further another location are typically related to feed. And we know that what really drives the cow to the robot is feed. And we might think it's the feed in the robot, which it is to some degree, but it's also in an indoor confinement type housing situation, it's going to be the feed that we provide at the feed bunk, so the PMR that we provide to those cows. And I like to make the argument that it's really both of those things that are just as important in terms of stimulating and affecting the milking behavior of cows in robotic systems. Now, the same thing applies to, say, a pasture-based dairy, whereby we know that, again, there might be some attractiveness there of the feed that we provide in the robot to the cows, but even more so is the pasture that cow is potentially moving towards. And so as we have cows move, say, from one paddock to the next, we're using that attractiveness, that desire to get to the next paddock as really that stimulus point for that cow. And that's really what's driving her in most cases to that robotic unit. And that's what's going to influence her desire or her ability to milk. And so if I were to summarize kind of keys to nutritional management in robotic dairies at this point in my presentation, my kind of suggestion would be that number one, and this would apply to any dairy kind of situation, is to maximize intake. And again, it doesn't matter if we're dealing with robot herds or any herd, we know dry matter intake, nutrient intake is going to really push milk production. And so that's first and foremost. And so we have to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're making sure that a cow has every opportunity to eat as much as she can to be able to do that. And then secondary to that, through the nutritional management that we provide, we want to encourage good voluntary visits to that robot. And so whether we're feeding a PMR, a partial mixed ration in a confinement system, or we're feeding pasture in an more extensive type system, we need to make sure that that is going to drive those cows to the robot. And so part of that is the quality of the forage that we provide, and I'll come back to this in a bit. And then also good consistency in eating behavior and feed access. And we'll talk about these in more detail a little later in the presentation. The other thing is to make sure that the robot concentrate feed that we provide is something obviously that the cows are also going to desire to eat. So it should be palatable, it should be of good quality. We know, and again, there's some discussion around this, but a good quality pellet is going to be not only consumed faster, but it's going to be, especially one that doesn't break down, is going to be consumed more completely than, say, something that's either individual kind of feed components or a pellet that, say, falls apart and has a lot of fines in it. We also know that ration does need to be, particularly again in our more confinement type systems, formulated to fit the traffic system that we are using, and I'll describe that a little bit more detail as we go along here. To that end, one of the things that we always have to keep in mind, and I think that's just to keep that in the back of our heads when we think about the role that the concentrate provides in the robot for the cow, and this really is regardless of the situation that we're feeding it in, whether again it is a more intensive confinement type situation, or if we're feeding cows in a more extensive type pasture, say, based scenario. The role of that concentrate is really to provide some level of attractant to that cow, some kind of candy that's going to keep that cow occupied while she's milking, and provide that just that little extra stimulus for that cow to move into that robotic unit. Now, beyond that, as I was just mentioning, we can then also adjust that and the amount of that specifically depending on various factors. And some of that is going to be cow needs. And so depending on stage of lactation, depending on the production level of the cows, depends on the feed availability. And so again, in a more extensive situation, as we get into certain times of the year where we might be, say, have lesser, say, pasture availability, and we're maybe feeding a little bit more around the robot as well, we might be putting a little bit more into the robot or for the cows in that situation as well. And then a big one specifically in our conventional, our more intensive confinement type herds that we would see typically here in Canada would be the type of traffic setup would also have an influence there on that amount as well. And again, in our free traffic systems, which again we see primarily within our industry, it's really that robot concentrate that's critical to drive those cows to the robot. And so again, I'll reiterate the fact that in that situation, the feed that we provide there, it has to be palatable and good quality. Typically in that situation, we're feeding a PMR that's being balanced to have kind of an allowable milk level if consumed on its own. That is what we'd say is below herd average. And so typically those PMR, and again, that does vary, and I don't want to be too prescriptive, but if we look across diets and farms that are out there in the industry, it's typically around 80% of the herd average production. And so that's for a lot of our herds, which are kind of in that 35 to 40 kilogram of milk production per day, that's typically balanced at about 7 to 9 kilos lesser production than kind of that herd average. And then on the flip side of that, we're typically feeding in those scenarios anywhere from on average about 3 to 8 kilograms per day concentrate on the robot. And what's surprising, or maybe not surprising, is that the distribution of that, even though that's the range, the distribution is actually pretty tight. And we have some recent data to suggest that the majority of farms in Canada, and when we look at the data that's out there, they're typically feeding on average about 5 to 5.5 kilograms of feed through that robot per day. And I'll come to that in a couple minutes, why that, or where that number actually likely comes from. When thinking about our guided systems, the drive to the robot's a little bit different. And so in say a milk first type system, as I described before, the cows get pre-selected to milk on their way to the feed bunk in a confinement system, and then have free return to their stalls. And so it's really the motivation there is going to the feed bunk, and they're either selected for milking or not based on their permissions and whether or not they're due at that time point. And this would be probably most similar to a grazing type system, whereby again the cows are moving from one paddock to another, and depending again on their, say, time interval since their last milking and their permission, they'll either be selected for milking or not as they move from one feeding area to another. And again, the motivation is really the feed that's kind of on the other side there, right? And so in our confinement systems, that PMR is really often formulated for an allowance of milk that's close to the herd average and sometimes even above. And so it's really what's driving the cows. And in these types of systems, we typically see kind of the lowest level of concentrate fed in the robot in our confinement type systems, where the average would be typically in the industry about 1.5 to 3.5 kilos per day. Again, there is some variation around that, but that's really kind of what we'd see on average. Feed first type systems, it's a little bit different. In those type systems, we actually see free access to the bunk, and so cows can move from their lying area to the feed bunk, but then get selected to the robots on return to the stalls. And in this case, we don't want those cows standing around waiting, standing in the feed bunk area, and so we need to basically have a motivation for those cows to get back to their lying stalls as well. And so typically in this scenario, the motivation is again a little bit more placed on the robotic feed, and so the PMR is closer to herd average in terms of its formulation or allowable milk kind of level, where we tend to feed maybe a little bit more feed in the robot. Now, this is probably the least popular kind of setup that we see in the industry, and is probably one of the most difficult to manage, from making sure that we get cows or make sure that cows cycle well through the barn and don't have, say, some of those excessive standing times that I was mentioning earlier. Now, as we think about how we feed cows specifically at the robot, and again, in these more intensive type situations where we're feeding higher levels of concentrate at the robot, it's good for us to consider some of the challenges around that. And there are some challenges, and probably the biggest one that we know and that we've learned is the fact that the amount of feed that we provide at the robot will actually influence the amount of feed that the cows will consume elsewhere. And so realizing that, yeah, cows are typically limited as far as their total consumption. Now, we try to push consumption, but they're going to have a maximum. And if we try to push too much feed in one spot, it's going to come at the expense of somewhere else. And so we see that when we look at data, and this is just an example. This is one study that I was a collaborator on with Dr. Greg Penner's group from the University of Saskatchewan, whereby we're looking at four levels, of concentrate provision in the robot. So very low, 0.5 kilo, 2 kilograms, 3.5 kilograms, and 5 kilograms. And basically what we observed is that as we increase the amount of feed that we provided to the cows in this scenario, and these cows were kept in a feed first guided flow system, and I'll point that out. What we saw is that their intake at the feed bunk, declined in kind of a substitutionary manner. And so basically every bit of extra grain those cows ate at the robot came at the expense of the amount of feed that they ate of their PMR. And so at the end of the day, their level of feed consumption was the same. We replicated that at a study at our research institute where we have a free traffic system where we saw something similar but not quite the same. And in this case, we saw those cows that were fed a high level of concentrate at the robot, 6 kilograms versus 3 kilograms. Again, we saw a substitution whereby those cows fed a high level, ate less PMR, but not to the same degree as we saw in that other study and some of the other studies that we've done in guided systems, whereby at the end of the day, we see a little bit more dry matter intake from those cows. And so that's a good thing at the end of the day if we make sure that that extra grain we might be providing isn't coming at the expense of those cows eating at the feed bunk or at their total, dry matter consumption. And I thought I'd throw this up. It's a busy slide and it's a busy table, but this is really a summary of all the studies that are published. And again, these are all intensive type feeding scenarios, cows eating PMR, milking in robots, where the authors have looked at both the consumption of the feed at the bunk as well as consumption of feed at the robot. And what I'd key in on is this right column here, which is a substitution ratio, which is basically how much feed gets substituted, how much feed at the feed bunk gets substituted for every extra kilo of grain at the robot. And so anything over a kilogram would be concerning to us because that means that those cows are actually eating less overall. That is not consistent across studies. And we see some studies like the one that I just described, some of the ones that we've done, and some others where we see numbers that are less than one, which would suggest that there's potential for a little bit greater intake in those cows. Now, the challenge is that we thought we'd see consistency with, say, stage of lactation or barn design and all these kind of things, but really we don't see that consistency. What we do see as consistent is the fact that those studies whereby we see a substitution ratio less than 1, so basically every kilo of extra grain at the robot doesn't mean at least 1 kilo less grain or less feed at the feed bunk, we see a positive from a yield and milking visit standpoint. And so really at the end of the day, it comes back to making sure that we're optimizing feed consumption in our cows at a total consumption level. And if we're ensuring that, then we're going to have potentially positive intakes, obviously, on production and milking performance. Another point I want to make quickly is the fact that just because we program a certain amount for cows at the robot doesn't necessarily mean they get it or actually consume it. And so there's a whole bunch of things that come into play there. So again, how often the cow milks, the amount of time since her last milking, the interval between milking is all very important. If those are inconsistent and she milks 2 times one day, 3 times the next, 4 times the next day, the robot, even though the robot it will apportion based on that, the more variable she is, the harder time it's going to have in terms of trying to target what that cow should be getting on a milking by milking basis. The other challenge can be how much the cow can actually eat and how fast she can actually eat within that robot, specifically based on how much time she spends milking there as well. And I like to use this data here, and this is some data again from Dr. Penner from Saskatchewan, where he just summarized how at different, say, if you look on the top left here, different dispensing rates and different milking durations, that's going to dictate how much feed could be offered to a cow on a per milking basis. Now, the challenge we have is that on average, most cows are milking for about 7 minutes per milking. And even at that, let's say a dispensing rate of 300 grams, the maximum kind of meal size in that scenario would be about 2.1 kilos. Let's say they ate a little bit faster or than that, we could probably get up to about 2.5 kilos per milking. And what we see in the industry is that even though some of these dispensing rates may be very high, the ability of the cows to keep up to that can be challenged. And in fact, the average cow only consumes grain at about 250 grams per minute. So we can program it for 500, but doesn't necessarily mean she's going to eat it that fast. Some cows can eat at 300, 400, 500 grams per minute, but the average cow is probably only eating at about 250, maybe 300 grams per minute. And so getting a meal size that's much bigger than say 2.5 kilograms can be very difficult for us. And especially as we push, say, milking speeds on cows to quite low levels. If you look on the right here, you see quite a bit of variation in milk yield per cow. But what you see is that even there's some cows here that are pushing 17, 18, almost 19 kilograms per milking in less than 6 minutes. And so our ability to get, say, the grain we want into those cows may be challenged in some of those scenarios. So from a practical perspective, again, particularly thinking about situations where we may be providing more feed in that robot, for the average cow, which again eats at about 250 grams per minute in a 7-minute milking, that's about 1.8 kilograms per milking of feed that we could reasonably expect the average cow to consume. And so with say an average of 3 milkings per day, which is typically what we would expect in our system, in our dairies, that'd be an average of about 5 to 5.4 kilograms of concentrate in the robot per day. And that's what I wanted to highlight earlier when I said when we look at the data in the industry, that's really where the average is. And I don't think it's necessarily something that we're specifically formulating for, but it's actually a result of the behavior of the cows in terms of how often they're milking, how long they're milking, and the eating rate of those cows. And that's really kind of the average that we see in the industry. Now, again, doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to limit us, and we can definitely feed above and below that to individual cows based on, say, their milking frequency and their yield and their capacity. But from a herd level perspective, we shouldn't likely expect to be able to formulate kind of an average level any higher than that, and reasonably kind of expect us to be achieving that, because it's just biologically it becomes very difficult for us to do that. Another point I wanted to make, and that's that it may be difficult to meet the needs of cows at all stages of lactation as well, particularly when we're feeding cows to their requirements to some degree with the robot feed that we're providing to them. And we have some data to suggest, particularly early lactation cows, we might have some difficulty there in terms of getting them to the robot enough, which I can't stress enough needs to be done to take advantage of, obviously, some of the benefits of getting frequent milking in those cows in early lactation, but then also getting enough consumption into those cows at that time as well. And so some of our recent work has been focused on looking at whether or not we can potentially supply additional kind of energy precursors for those animals in early lactation to kind of bridge that energy gap. And so looking at things like glycerol and molasses, so things that are high in kind of gluconeogenic precursors, which are going to allow us to get a little bit more energy, not necessarily starch, which we know is bad from a rumen standpoint at that time point in lactation, or extra starches, and trying to get some energy into the cows that way. And we have some data that comes out of a study we published this year where we actually looked at providing cows in the early postpartum period with some molasses in the robot on top of their regular pellet, just to get them some extra energy. And what we see in that scenario is that those cows that get molasses actually had a lesser incidence or a repeat incidence of subclinical ketosis. And so some benefit there from that perspective. For the last little bit of my presentation, I just want to kind of cover the fact, and I mentioned this before, that we're also going to drive total nutrient intake and milking visits through both PMR and in our grazing systems pasture management. And one of the reasons for that or associated with that is the fact that milking times are often linked to periods of feeding activity. And so this is from a study of ours. This is data from a PMR fed kind of confinement type situation, robotic milking. But what you see is this real diurnal pattern of milking behavior, where there's spikes in milkings per day in the morning and in late afternoon. And it almost looks like a feeding pattern in cows. And what we notice actually in this study, and we see that in other scenarios, is that these peaks in milking activity really correspond to times when cows are eating. And so in this case, this is times of feed delivery where we see the greatest amounts of milkings. And so the actual drive to go eat is also corresponding with those cows getting up and going to the milking robot. And we'll see that in both free and guided traffic systems. In the case of this study, the extra arrows I just put up here also correspond to feed push-up times. And we know that's also going to potentially get those cows or stimulate them to eat in some scenarios. And so again, we see a response from those cows. And so that's interesting, because what we'd like to see in a robotic scenario is we'd like to see this line, this milking frequency line, as flat as possible, because if we can keep it as high and flat as possible, we're going to be able to maximize the efficiency, get the most amount of milkings through that robot per day, and kind of maximize the efficiency of that across a 24-hour time period. And so question then becomes is, when does a cow go and eat, and how do we really ensure that that cow is going to go eat regularly throughout the day at the feed bunk, at pasture, and make sure that we optimize kind of those milking frequencies throughout the day. And probably the simplest answer to this question of when does a cow go and eat is when she's hungry. And again, well, when is a cow hungry? Well, a cow is hungry basically once she's really digested the feed or processed the feed that she's consumed, as well as the metabolites that come from that feed that have been absorbed in her system, things like propionate that are potentially influencing hunger through kind of liver activation and those kind of things. Now, we know, and this is quite simplified, but when we think of intake in the rumen, it's really a function of how fast that cow can digest the feed and how fast she can pass that feed from the rumen. And this is really simplified, but the primary kind of factor that's going to influence that is the digestibility of the feed going into that rumen. And so that's why we talk about forage digestibility of being king when it comes to feeding cows, because the faster that cow can digest that forage, the more digestible it is, the faster it passes through, the faster we can fill up that rumen again. And so that directly influences the eating behavior of those cows as well. And so the faster she eats, or sorry, digests, the faster she clears that rumen, the quicker she's going to return to eating. And so it has a direct impact on the eating behavior of those cows. We also know that that eating behavior of those cows is going to be dictated by certain management events or times of day. Often we'll see cows eating in this kind of diurnal feeding pattern. And this, again, for grazing cattle would be very common, where we see spikes in feeding activity in the morning and late afternoon. Now, for cows that are fed conserved diets, PMRs, TMRs, that is often then even more so dictated by when we deliver feed to those cows. And so the timing of feed delivery of PMR is going to have a huge impact, potentially the frequency and timing of that on some of these feeding patterns of these cows, and then on their corresponding robot attendance as well. In a grazing system, it's going to be that access to that next paddock that's going to have then that big influence, and we see evidence of that. And so this is just one example where there's a comparison of milking consistency throughout a 24-hour period with a three-way graze versus a two-way. And again, in the two-way, which is represented in the black bars, when we look at the pattern, you see kind of that diurnal pattern where you see a peak in the morning in terms of frequency of milkings, and then again in the later evening and early morning hours. And I would suggest that that's going to correspond again to the pattern of movement of those cows from one, say, grazing paddock to another, whereby with a three-way graze, we can potentially eliminate that and stimulate more, not only feeding activity at times of the day when we might not expect as much feeding activity, but we're also going to see more milking activity in those scenarios as well. And so how do we then ensure that eating behavior, in addition to what I've already just said, well, there's a couple things I think that we need to consider. Number one, in all systems, regardless if we're feeding conserved diets or we're grazing cattle, we need to make sure we have good feed quality. And so better quality forages, more digestible forages are really what's going to drive nearly everything at the end of the day. Beyond that, we can manage then the feed in the scenario that we're in. And so in a PMR system, in a confinement system, we want to ensure continuous feed access. And what our research and others have showed is that the feed must be there when cows go to eat. The primary driver for those cows should be their internal hunger, so which is going to be driven by the quality of the feed. Then secondary to that, it's going to be when they do get up and they go to the bunk and they're hungry, whether or not there's feed there for them. And so we see benefits in terms of feeding the cows more often, getting fresh feed in front of them more often, and then making sure, as you see on the screen and the pictures, pushing up that feed. And again, regardless of how we do it, we need to make sure that feed gets pushed up frequently and often for those animals. And as a result of that, we actually see a benefit from a behavioral standpoint. And we have evidence from one study as shown on the screen, as well as another one where we actually see in robot barns a response from a lying behavior standpoint. So cows spending more time lying down and resting when they have better feed access. So when we push up their feed more often, and it goes back to what I was describing earlier, they're probably wasting less time standing around looking for feed, waiting for feed, and they can actually use their time budget more appropriately and spend a better time lying down, which is going to have a benefit from a rumination and intake standpoint in those cows. There's some really kind of striking data that comes out of a study out of the Midwest US, where they looked at a cohort of robot farms and demonstrated that farms that were pushing up feed with an automated pusher had way higher milk, 5 kilograms more milk on those herds. Now, I would argue that it's not the feed pusher that's driving this difference. It's actually the fact that those herds that were not using a feed pusher were probably just not doing a good enough job. And so they had situations likely where they just had empty bunks, situations where the cows did not have access to feed. And because of that, they were limited in their feed consumption, and we see that production difference. And so at the end of the day, I don't care how it's done as long as it gets done consistently and frequently. I mentioned this before as well. We also need to make sure cows have sufficient space. And I mentioned that from a lameness perspective being important. A couple of the studies we've done with robot herds have also showed that more space can equal more lying time and more milk. And again, we think sometimes that we can get away with less space in robot barns because the cows might not be as synchronized in their behavior, but the data would suggest otherwise. Cows still want to eat at certain times of the day, may eat together. We want to limit competition, and we want to make sure those cows can get to the bunk when they need to. And then lastly, very quickly, in grazing systems, again, I'll make the point, we want continuous feed access, but we need to make sure we're managing the amounts available through the day so that those cows have the desire to seek out new feed. And so again, making sure our pasture allocations are properly allocated so that those cows run out in a good amount of time so that they are motivated then to seek the next paddock and the next location. And so going back to the example I mentioned before, that's why I say a three-way grazing system has shown to be more beneficial than a two-way in terms of stimulating milking activity, getting better milking intervals, and maybe even more. And I've seen some evidence that maybe even a four-way graze, again, more difficult to manage, but may even be more beneficial than, say, a three-way graze in terms of stimulating that milking activity in these cows. And then thinking of other feeds that we might be providing, again, some data that comes from our host here as well, suggesting that, say, locating feed pads or supplemental feed after milking may be more beneficial from a milking behavior standpoint as well, and probably from other perspectives as well, in terms of having those cows, say, have a meal after they've been milked, keeping them on their feet before they, say, have that desire to go lie down. And so giving them that time, their teat ends some time to close up, and all those kind of good things from that perspective as well, before those cows eventually lie down and rest. So that gets me to the end of my presentation. Just really quick take-homes: ensuring good nutritional management, make sure cows have the desire and ability to milk voluntarily. Part of that's going to be what we do at the robot from a feed standpoint there, in terms of meeting the needs and matching that to the system we're using. But then probably, or I would say more important, is making sure cows eat the feed that we're providing the bulk of their nutrients from, and that's going to be their PMR or pasture. And so again, highly digestible, good quality forages, making sure feed's always available, accessible, and really desirable to those cows. And so I'd like to quickly thank various funders of our research. Without their contributions to a lot of this work, this wouldn't be possible, and hope we have some time for some questions yet here today as well. So thank you.
Excellent, Trevor. Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. I think there's been a lot of pearls of wisdom in there. So probably the best part was the reference to the studies we did over here. Just kidding there, but nah. Thank you very much, and it's good to see some studies mentioned of people that have presented here before, like Megan King. So that's fantastic. There's been a couple of questions come through. So we'll tackle some of them. Let me open the question tab. The first one is, you did mention the effect of auto feed pushers. What is the adoption of them and kind of the adoption levels? And are you seeing auto push feeders, or also kind of the feeders, the wagons that come multiple times throughout the day?
Yeah, so good question, and I would say we're seeing the adoption of technology on the feeding side throughout the industry. Definitely, the adoption of the automated feed pushers is kind of leading that. In that, say that a benchmarking study that we did, where we have close to 200 herds. Close to 70% of those are using an automated pusher. So 140 or so out of 200 farms are using an automated feed pusher. And so that's really interesting, because that's up from, let's say, 5-6 years ago, where we've done some of these studies. We didn't see nearly the same level of kind of technology adoption. What's interesting, and I didn't present that tonight as well, but even within that, so we see differences in how the cows are responding. And so an increased number of push-ups, just making sure that feed is always there, it's always turned over and back to those cows, even within that high adoption rate. And so it's not the technology necessarily itself, it's how often we're doing that, because we see actually benefit. In that study, we saw those herds that are pushing up more often with those automated technologies are getting more milk. And so there's benefit there. And then, yeah, we also see adoption of automated PMR mixing and delivery systems. And I would say that that's going to continue to grow. Now, not at the same level. We see benefit, again, of feeding cows frequently. But I'll make the caveat there, and this is where it's kind of a little bit different from say a grazing system, whereby we want to make sure that that feed's always there and the cows don't run out. It's not like a grazing system where you want to bring them down so that they're kind of motivated to move on, but you want it to be always there, because the problem we run into when we have that feed get down and we end up with an empty bunk is that the cows then lose interest, they go away, and then the next time the feed comes, they come running back. And then we see not only problems at the feed bunk, but we see our robot systems then start to plug up as well. And we end up with these real diurnal kind of milking patterns, which aren't as efficient either.
Yeah, and I guess we see the same in grazing systems when the total amount of feed is limiting. So when total amount of feed in the system on a day basis is limiting, we tend to see the same effects in grazing. There's another question here, is do you have any comment about what is the recommended forage NDF in a PMR for a milk first guided traffic?
So very specific. Forage NDF or total NDF, or?
The question here is forage NDF, but yeah, I don't know if you have.
Yeah. Again, I'm not going to give numbers. It's a good question, just because it's going to really come back to what that PMR is formulated as. And I mentioned there is some variation around that. And so some of those PMRs look very similar to our traditional lactating cow TMRs in a parlor type system, especially in a milk first guided system. And so not a whole lot of difference there. And it's going to also vary depending on where you are and the types of forages that you have, as well as, say, maybe sources of non-forage fiber that you might have available to you and within that diet as well. And so I think all those things are play a role there. And I would suggest the person that's asking that question, very good question. I'd be happy to engage with that person more if they send me an email and give me a little bit more kind of details about their situation, and I'd be happy to answer that.
Excellent, thanks for that offer. The other question is, what is the role of water? Can we use water as a motivator for cow traffic?
Yeah, no, very good. Water also very important. We know that water consumption is going to be highly related to probably two things in the cow's life. One is milking, and so they tend to drink after milking, more so than before milking. And we also know that water is primarily consumed during meals at the feed bunk or during eating bouts. And so water space in general should never be limited from that perspective, because it's highly correlated with intake levels. Basically, we want to make sure that happens. There is some suggestion or indication that if we have water troughs near the robot, that's okay, as long as, again, we have sufficient space around that it's not creating any kind of bottleneck, right? Because the cows will congregate around those water troughs. And so we just need to make sure that, depending on where those are located, that we're not creating a bottleneck situation or somewhere where the cows are going to bunch up. And so as long as we have sufficient space between, say, the robot and the entrance to that robot, or a selection gate per se, and the water, we should be fine there. And then definitely in a confinement system, we want to make sure that we also then within the barn have water at other locales down the rows of stalls to keep the cows cycling that way as well and keep them moving.
Excellent. Then there's another question that says, if we could predict how cows will move in a robotic barn by evaluating the forage digestibility, can we have a threshold ration digestibility number when we know cows will move better?
Yeah, again, I wouldn't have an answer as far as the threshold or level of digestibility that person. Again, it's going to come back to the diet, right? And so it comes back to what types of forages, right? And so if it's in a lot of ours, we have diets that are heavily corn silage based, right? And so that's going to be different than if you're more of an alfalfa or grass-based diet, or if you, like I said before, you have a lot of, say, non-forage fiber, say, in the diet or something like that. I think the point is, though, that in situations where, let's say, our digestibility of our diet is not as good as we'd like it to be, that's where we do end up with some risks, as far as cows are going to take a little bit longer to eat. They're going to be a little bit slower to digest their feed and return to the feed bunk. And so in those situations, yeah, we need to really make sure that we're doing a good job from a feeding management standpoint, even from the milking robot standpoint, as far as attracting those cows and making sure that they're getting to the robot frequently enough.
Excellent. There's two more questions. One is, what do you see around variability around concentrate intake when you mentioned program delivered and consumed? Kind of what variability levels are you seeing kind of at a herd level in there?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and I'm trying to remember some of the numbers right off the top of my head, but that's something we've looked at in terms of variation and from a couple different perspectives. So I mentioned that, yeah, like as we say increase concentrate allowance at the robot, we see this kind of decrease in PMR consumption. We also see more variability day to day, and that ties into some of those other things I mentioned in terms of just say making sure, right, like milking intervals are very consistent, milking frequencies, because if they're not, and we're trying to get cows to eat fairly large amounts at the robot and individual milking visits, then we run the risk of those visits kind of from visit to visit, the variability increasing. And so we see basically we'll see increased variation as we try to feed more at that robot. And we'll also see increased variability from kind of targeted to actual. And so from a practical standpoint, that's what I also often recommend to advisors, nutritionists, equipment advisors, veterinarians, whoever that might be looking at some of this data sometimes, is not only look at obviously the feed tables, what we program, but actually look at the end of the day what the cows are doing, how much they're getting, and how much deviation there is. Because obviously, if they're not hitting those targets, that's a problem from a production formulation standpoint. And so we need to be careful that variation doesn't get too big.
Perfect. And the last question probably links to that one in the sense of if you want to increase the amount of concentrate that you get into cows, what are some of the strategies that some farmers or advisors are using? And the comments are around priority feeding, so keeping cows in the robot for more time after they finish milking, feed stations, or use of multiple feeds in the robot. What are your thoughts around those?
Yeah, oh yeah, all very good questions. I think the probably based on what we kind of would expect as well, that based on and some of the numbers I presented, like if we're formulating diets like in our confinement systems for, let's say on average about 5.5 kilograms of concentrate per day, let's say that's 1.8 kilograms about per milking, cows should easily be able to achieve that level of consumption in the robot. Some cows, again, if they're on the higher production level and they're on a feed table where they're getting more, maybe 7 or 8 kilos per day, they should be able to do it as well, with the expectation as well that those cows, not only obviously they're going to be eating more, potentially eating a little faster, but especially in early lactation, we want to make sure that those cows are milking frequently enough as well. And I kind of alluded to that we have really good old data to suggest that our peak milks and our milking persistency in cows are going to be optimized if we get those cows to milk frequently in early lactation. And so our target should be, and even from a milking setting standpoint, allowing those cows to get to that robot as frequently as possible in the first month of lactation at least. And so my target for, say, early lactation cows is at least 4 milkings per day. And that's not only going to allow those cows to spread out their intake and get enough intake in them, but really take advantage of the impact that has on the mammary cells of those cows and at the same time.
Excellent. Trevor, I want to thank you very much once again for your time. It's been a fantastic presentation and follow up with questions. So once again, thank you very much for your time. I know it's late in the day for you, so I appreciate that one, and thank you for your time.
No, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
No worries. So for all of you on the line, if you want to follow some of our initiatives, we've got a New South Wales DPI Dairy website and a New South Wales DPI Dairy Facebook page. You can follow and join any of those. We also have a community of interest around AMS, out of which Trevor is one of the people that are contributing there. So just jump on board, and a newsletter that we send out 4 times a year. So feel free to follow or join any of those initiatives. Last but not least, as part of the Milking Edge project, there is a project in the Australian dairy industry supported by Dairy Australia, New South Wales DPI and De Laval, that is around supporting farmers to consider, invest and operate AMS successfully. We've built some online training information packages and they're available online, free and 24 hours a day. So just jump on board, The link is on the screen at the moment, and you can access them whenever you want. So without further ado, thank you very much, all of you who have registered, dialed in, and kept online for slightly over an hour. It's been a pleasure. This presentation is recorded and will become available, and will be available on the New South Wales DPI Dairy website. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again next time. Bye.